They called it the Great Silence, 300 years of cosmic quiet that followed humanity's disappearance from known space. The Galactic Council celebrated, believing they had finally rid the universe of the chaotic species that refused to bow to their ancient order. They raised monuments to their victory and rewrote history books, painting humans as a cautionary tale of what happens when a race lacks discipline and respect for established power. But silence, as any predator knows, often precedes the hunt. What the Council didn't understand was that humanity's greatest strength had never been their technology, their weapons, or even their stubborn defiance. It was their ability to adapt, to survive, and to emerge from the darkest moments not just alive, but transformed into something far more dangerous than what came before. The Council thought they had witnessed humanity's final chapter. They were about to discover it was merely the prologue. Ambassador Zethkar stood before the towering crystal displays of the Galactic Council chamber, his 6 eyes scanning the peaceful star maps that showed controlled, orderly trade routes crisscrossing the galaxy. 3 centuries had passed since the human problem had been resolved, and the galaxy had never known such prosperity and harmony. The violent, unpredictable species that had once threatened the established order was nothing more than a distant memory, their worlds now properly governed by council-appointed administrators. The tribute ships from the former human sectors are arriving on schedule, reported Ade Velnith, her tentacles dancing across the data crystals with practiced efficiency. Agricultural output from Earth is up 12% this cycle, and the mining operations on Mars have exceeded quotas for the 15th consecutive period. Zethkar's mandibles clicked with satisfaction. The humans had been so chaotic, so resistant to the natural order of things. They had refused to accept their designated place in the galactic hierarchy, always pushing boundaries, asking questions that challenged the ancient wisdom of the council races. Their elimination from power had brought unprecedented peace to the galaxy. Any disturbances to report? Zethkar asked, though it was merely a formality. There hadn't been a significant uprising in any former human territory for over 200 years. Minor labor disputes on Titan, quickly resolved through proper disciplinary measures. Nothing that threatens the established order, Velnith replied, her tone carrying the confidence of 3 centuries of successful governance. The massive chamber doors hummed open, and Fleet Admiral Kordak strode in, his crystalline exoskeleton gleaming under the chamber's bioluminescent lighting. The Vorthan military commander carried himself with the assured bearing of someone who had never known defeat, never faced a challenge that the combined might of the council fleets couldn't crush. "Ambassador, I bring the monthly security briefing," Kordak announced, his voice resonating through specialized vocal chambers that made every word sound like a proclamation. "All sectors remain stable. Our patrol fleets report no unusual activity, no signs of organized resistance. The human population centers continue to accept council rule without significant protest." Zethkar nodded approvingly. The Vorthans had always been the perfect enforcers of council will, methodical, overwhelming, utterly convinced of their own superiority. Their crystal-based technology was among the most advanced in the galaxy, their ships nearly indestructible, their weapons capable of cracking planets. When the decision had been made to remove humans from positions of power, it was the Vorthans who had carried out the task with brutal efficiency. "The anniversary celebrations are proceeding as planned?" Zethkar inquired, referring to the upcoming commemoration of the Great Pacification, the Council's term for the systematic dismantling of human government and military forces. "Indeed. Representatives from over 1,000 member species have confirmed their attendance." "It will be the largest gathering in Council history," Kordak replied, a hint of pride in his harmonic tones. "A fitting celebration of 3 centuries of unprecedented peace and prosperity." What none of them knew was that at that very moment, beyond the carefully monitored borders of Council space, something was stirring in the cosmic dark. In systems too distant and hostile for even the Vorthans to patrol, where radiation storms made sensors useless and gravitational anomalies crushed most ships, small flickers of activity were beginning to emerge. The first sign came from a routine deep space monitoring station on the edge of the Kepler Nebula. Senior technician Yilmoth was conducting his standard shift when his instruments detected something unusual, a brief energy signature unlike anything in the Council databases. It lasted only seconds and was quickly dismissed as equipment malfunction. 2 days later, a similar signature appeared near the Horsehead Nebula, detected by a different monitoring station operated by a different species. Again, it was logged and, forgotten, considered too minor to report to higher authorities. Within a week, 7 more incidents occurred across the galaxy's unexplored regions. Each time, the energy signatures were slightly different, slightly more complex, as if whatever was creating them was learning, adapting, improving with each iteration. It wasn't until the 8th incident that someone began to notice a pattern. Junior analyst Piptel, a young member of the scholarly Nedrin species, was conducting a routine review of deep space anomalies when she noticed the timing and distribution of the energy signatures. They weren't random, they were following a systematic pattern, appearing to test different frequencies, different power levels, different modulations. Piptel was about to file her findings when a new signal appeared on her instruments. This one was different, stronger, more focused, and accompanied by something that made her 3 hearts skip beats. It was a transmission, brief but unmistakable, in a long-dead language that existed only in the Council's historical archives. The message was simple, transmitted in what the archives identified as English: testing complete. Beginning Phase 2. By the time Piptel had decoded the transmission and understood its implications, it was already too late. Across 30 different star systems, massive structures were beginning to emerge from the cosmic deep ships, but not like any ships in the Council databases. These vessels were sleek, organic-looking, as if they had grown rather than been built. They pulsed with energy patterns that seemed to bend space around them, creating visual distortions that made them difficult to track or target. The largest of these ships was approaching the outer edge of Council space, moving at speeds that should have been impossible, ignoring the physical laws that govern traditional faster-than-light travel. It broadcast no identification signals, responded to no communications, simply continued its steady approach toward the heart of Council territory. Fleet Admiral Kordak was in the middle of a strategic planning session when the alerts began cascading across his command center. His subordinates rushed to their stations as sensor data flooded in from across the galaxy's periphery, each report more alarming than the last. "Sir, we're detecting massive unidentified vessels emerging from deep space," reported his tactical officer, Commander Zarvex. 37 distinct signatures, all moving on intercept courses with major Council systems. "Impossible," Kordak declared, but, even as he spoke, he was analyzing the incoming data. The ships were unlike anything he had ever encountered, their energy signatures defied classification, their speed exceeded all known technological capabilities, and their apparent size suggested vessels larger than entire Council battle fleets. "Are they responding to hails?" Kordak demanded. "Negative, sir. They appear to be ignoring all attempts at communication." Kordak's crystalline fingers traced rapid commands across his control interface, pulling up tactical projections and fleet positions. The nearest Council battle group was 3 days away from the closest unidentified vessel, but, at current speeds, the unknown ships would reach major population centers within hours. "Deploy the 7th Fleet to intercept the closest vessel." "Full combat readiness," Kordak ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never retreated from a fight. "Whatever these ships are, they'll learn that Council space is protected." As the massive Vorthan warships moved to intercept, their crews confident in their technological superiority, the approaching vessels made their first direct response. It wasn't a weapon or a shield or any form of defensive measure the Vorthans recognized. Instead, the lead ship simply broadcast a message across all frequencies, in dozens of languages, including several that had been considered extinct for centuries. The message was brief, but it struck terror into the hearts of every Council member who heard it. "This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the Human Expeditionary Force. We've come home." In the Council chambers, Ambassador Zethkar stared at the emergency reports flooding his displays, his 6 eyes wide with disbelief. The humans were supposed to be broken, scattered, reduced to agricultural laborers on their own former worlds. They had no fleet, no technology, no means of challenging Council authority. But, as the reports continued to arrive, as sensor data showed ships that surpassed every known technological standard, as communication arrays picked up transmissions from dozens of vessels speaking in human languages thought to be forgotten, one terrible truth became undeniable. The Council hadn't destroyed humanity. They had simply driven it away, out into the cosmic wilderness where it had 300 years to grow, to adapt, to become something entirely new. And, now, Whatever humanity had become in the depths of space was returning to reclaim what had once been theirs. The Great Silence was ending, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Seventh Fleet's encounter with Admiral Chen's flagship lasted exactly 17 minutes. Fleet Admiral Kordak watched in growing horror as his sensors recorded every second of what could barely be called a battle. His most powerful warships, vessels that had conquered dozens of star systems and reduced entire civilizations to submission, were systematically dismantled with a precision that bordered on artistry. The human ship, if it could still be called that, didn't use weapons in any traditional sense. Instead, it projected fields of energy that seemed to convince matter itself to change, causing the molecular bonds in Vorthan crystal armor to simply dissolve. Entire sections of Council warships crumbled to dust while their crews watched in helpless amazement, their emergency systems failing to even register the nature of the attack. "Sir, the destroyer Kethron is reporting total systems failure," Commander Zarvex's voice cracked with disbelief. "Their armor it's turning to powder. The crew is abandoning ship." Kordak's mandibles clicked frantically as he processed the impossible data streaming across his displays. His ships weren't being destroyed, they were being gently, efficiently dismantled, their crews evacuated by small human vessels that appeared to be made of living metal. Not a single Vorthan life had been lost, but his entire fleet was being rendered inoperative with casual ease. "Order all ships to retreat immediately," Kordak commanded, his pride warring with the tactical necessity of preserving what remained of his forces. "Fall back to the inner defense perimeter." As the Seventh Fleet limped away from the engagement zone, Admiral Chen's ship broadcast another message, this time directed specifically at Kordak's flagship. When her image appeared on the main display, Kordak barely suppressed a gasp of shock. The woman addressing him looked human, but wrong in ways that made his predator instincts scream warnings. Her skin had a subtle luminescence, as if starlight flowed beneath the surface. Her eyes held depths that seemed to contain swirling galaxies, and, when she moved, there was a fluid grace that suggested she was equally at home in the vacuum of space as in atmosphere. Most disturbing of all was her smile, warm, genuine, and completely without malice despite having just disabled an entire battle fleet. "Fleet Admiral Kordak," she said, her voice somehow reaching him across the void with perfect clarity. "I remember you from the history files. You commanded the assault on Luna Base during the pacification. I was there, you know. I watched from the observation deck as your ships glassed the research stations and rounded up the survivors." Kordak's crystalline features hardened. "You were defeated. Your species accepted Council rule. This aggression violates 3 centuries of established order." Admiral Chen's laugh was like music played on instruments that didn't exist. "Defeated? Oh, Admiral, you have no idea what you actually accomplished that day. When you drove us from our worlds, when you scattered us to the cosmic winds, you didn't destroy us. You freed us." The image shifted, and, suddenly, Kordak found himself looking not at a single ship, but at a vast fleet stretching beyond the edge of sensor range. Thousands of vessels, each one unique, each one incorporating design principles that seemed to blend technology with biological growth patterns. They moved in formations that resembled living creatures more than military formations, flowing and adapting with a grace that made traditional fleet tactics seem clumsy and primitive. 300 years, Admiral, Chen continued. 300 years of exploring places your people never dared to go. We found things out there in the deep dark ancient ruins, abandoned technologies, life forms that existed on scales you can't imagine. And we learned. We adapted. We became something new. On Council Prime, emergency sessions were being called as reports flooded in from across the galaxy. The human fleet hadn't simply appeared in one location, they were everywhere simultaneously, emerging from the deep space regions that Council surveys had deemed uninhabitable or impossible to navigate. Ambassador Zethkar found himself at the center of a storm of panic as representatives from hundreds of species demanded answers, explanations, reassurances that their ancient enemy couldn't possibly have returned stronger than ever. The humans had no technology capable of this, insisted High Counselor Vexthera of the Andromedans, her psychic emanations causing the chamber's temperature to drop noticeably. "Our intelligence reports showed a broken people reduced to subsistence farming. How is this possible?" Zethkar consulted his data displays, trying to find rational explanations for the impossible. Perhaps they encountered some abandoned technology, some ancient artifact that augmented their primitive capabilities. Once we understand their new weapons, we can develop countermeasures. But, even as he spoke the words, Sethkar knew they rang hollow. The ships approaching Council space weren't using discovered technology, they pulsed with an organic harmony that suggested growth rather than construction, evolution rather than engineering. The truth was beginning to dawn on the Council leadership, though none wanted to voice it aloud. The humans hadn't found better technology in the cosmic deep. They had become better technology. Reports were coming in from human-populated worlds throughout Council space. On Earth, the agricultural workers who had labored quietly for 3 centuries were laying down their tools and looking up at the sky with expressions of eager anticipation. On Mars, the miners were emerging from the deep shafts, their faces bright with hope for the first time in living memory. But, strangest of all were the reports from the outer colonies, the worlds where humans had been relocated as punishment for their defiance. These populations were displaying behaviors that defied explanation, gathering in large groups, singing in harmonies that seemed to resonate with the approaching fleet's energy signatures, and somehow coordinating their actions across vast distances without any apparent means of communication. Dr. Thysera, the Council's chief xenobiologist, was studying these reports when she made a connection that chilled her 3-chambered heart. The humans weren't just communicating with the approaching fleet, they were part of it. Somehow, across the centuries of separation, the scattered human population had maintained a connection with their exiled kin. It's not possible, she whispered to herself, reviewing genetic scans from the outer colonies. They're still human, still baseline biology. There's no mechanism for this kind of distributed consciousness. But, the evidence was undeniable. Humans across the galaxy were acting in coordination, their movements synchronized in ways that suggested they were components of a larger organism. The approaching fleet wasn't coming to rescue the human population, it was coming home to reunite with it. Meanwhile, Admiral Chen's flagship had entered the Sol system, moving past the outer defensive platforms without engaging them. The Council forces stationed there watched in helpless fascination as the alien yet familiar ship approached Earth, its hull rippling with patterns of light that seemed to respond to something on the planet's surface. On Earth itself, in the great cities where Council administrators had ruled for centuries, something extraordinary was happening. The human population was gathering in massive crowds, their voices rising in songs that hadn't been heard since before the pacification. Children who had never seen a free human world were singing words and languages they shouldn't have known, their faces turned skyward with expressions of joy and recognition. The Council's control was evaporating not through violence or rebellion, but through simple irrelevance. The humans were no longer interested in fighting their oppressors, they were focused entirely on welcoming home family they had been separated from for too long. Admiral Chen's voice echoed across Earth's communication networks, speaking simultaneously in every human language and somehow reaching every human ear regardless of location or circumstance. We are home. We have learned. We have grown. We have become what we were always meant to be. On Council Prime, Fleet Admiral Kordak was receiving reports from across the galaxy that defied every military principle he understood. The human fleet wasn't conquering territory or establishing control zones. They were simply existing in space, their presence somehow making Council authority irrelevant without any apparent effort. Ships that approached the human vessels weren't destroyed or damaged, they were simply encouraged to leave, their crews finding their instruments redirecting them away from human-occupied space through methods they couldn't understand or resist. It was as if reality itself was gently but firmly suggesting that Council forces had somewhere else to be. "They're not fighting us," reported Captain Mordeth from the Outer Rim. "They're not even acknowledging us. It's like we become invisible to them, except when we get too close, and then we just find ourselves moving away." The most disturbing reports came from the human worlds themselves. Council administrators who had governed these planets for centuries were finding their authority simply evaporating. Their orders weren't being defied or resisted, they were being ignored as if they had never been spoken. The humans weren't rebelling, they were transcending the very concept of Council rule. As Admiral Chen's ship settled into Earth's orbit like a moon that had always belonged there, the truth became inescapable. The humans hadn't returned to reclaim their old place in the galaxy. They had returned to claim their new one, and that new place was so far beyond Council understanding that their ancient enemy had become something approaching gods. The Great Silence was indeed ending, but the symphony that was replacing it was being conducted by a human species that had spent 3 centuries in the cosmic wilderness learning to play instruments the Council had never dreamed existed. 3 months after the return, the galaxy had settled into a new reality that defied every assumption the Council had built their civilization upon. The human fleets hadn't conquered anything in the traditional sense, they had simply taken their place in a cosmic order that seemed to reshape itself around their presence. Ambassador Zethkar stood in what had once been the Galactic Council chamber, now serving as a museum of sorts. The great crystal displays still functioned, but they showed star maps that bore little resemblance to the carefully controlled territories of the old order. Instead of rigid boundaries and trade routes, the displays showed flowing patterns of light that seemed to pulse with life, connecting worlds in ways that suggested organic growth rather than political conquest. The humans had offered to meet with Council leadership, not as conquerors addressing the defeated, but as old acquaintances catching up after a long separation. The location they suggested was Earth itself, in a great amphitheater that seemed to have grown from the planet's surface rather than being constructed upon it. Zethkar adjusted his formal diplomatic robes as he prepared to descend to the surface, accompanied by representatives from the major Council species. None of them knew quite what to expect. The humans had changed in ways that challenged the very concept of what a species could become, yet their communications remained warm, patient, and oddly familiar. The transport that carried the Council delegation to Earth's surface was unlike anything in their technological databases. It moved by convincing space itself to flow around it, creating a journey so smooth that Zethkar barely felt they were moving at all. Through the transparent hull, he could see Earth spread out below them, not the carefully managed agricultural world they had created, but a planet that seemed to sing with vitality. Cities had grown in spiraling patterns that reminded him of seashells and flower petals, their buildings seeming to breathe with the same rhythm as the forests around them. Rivers had been redirected to flow in mathematical curves that were somehow both artificial and utterly natural. The sky itself seemed different, as if the atmosphere had been tuned to some cosmic harmony that made everything more vivid and alive. The amphitheater was exactly where the coordinates had indicated, but it clearly hadn't existed 3 days ago when the Council's last surveillance satellites had scanned this location. It rose from the earth like a flower opening to the sun, its walls incorporating living trees whose branches formed perfect acoustic channels. The seating areas were carved from stone that seemed to glow with inner light, and the whole structure hummed with a resonance that Zethkar could feel in his bones. Thousands of humans filled the amphitheater, but they weren't arranged in the formal, hierarchical patterns that Council gatherings required. Instead, they flowed in organic clusters that seemed to shift and change like murmuring streams, their conversations creating a background music that was both chaotic and perfectly harmonized. At the center of the amphitheater, Admiral Sarachan waited with a small group of other humans. But, seeing her in person, Zethkar realized that human was no longer an adequate description. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, her form subtly elongated in proportions that seemed designed for both terrestrial and space-based existence. Her skin held that same inner luminescence he had noticed in the transmissions, and her eyes contained depths that suggested she was simultaneously present in the amphitheater and somewhere unimaginably distant. "Welcome, old friends," Chen said, and her voice carried clearly to every seat in the amphitheater without any apparent amplification. "Please, sit wherever feels comfortable. We have much to discuss." The Council delegation found themselves guided to seats that seemed to mold themselves to their individual physiologies, providing perfect comfort for crystalline Vorthans and gaseous Andromedans alike. Around them, the human audience watched with expressions of gentle curiosity, as if the former galactic rulers were interesting visitors rather than representatives of a recently displaced power structure. "You have questions," Chen continued, settling into a chair that seemed to grow from the amphitheater floor at her approach. "We understand. 3 centuries is a long time, and we've changed in ways that probably seem impossible from your perspective. Let me try to explain what happened to us out there in the deep dark." A soft chime rang through the amphitheater, and, suddenly, the air above the gathering filled with images, not projected holograms, but something that seemed to edit reality itself to show scenes from humanity's long exile. Zethkar watched in fascination as the story unfolded above them. "When you drove us from our worlds, we had nowhere to go but the places you considered uninhabitable, Chen explained as the images showed human ships limping away from their conquered homes. The radiation storms, the gravitational anomalies, the regions of space where normal physics break down, that's where we learn to survive. The images shifted to show human settlements in impossible locations, cities built in the hearts of nebulae, communities that thrived in the crushing gravity wells of neutron stars, research stations that existed in the spaces between dimensions where conventional matter couldn't maintain coherence. At first, it was just survival, Chen continued. We adapted our technology, modified our ships, learned to work with forces that would have destroyed our old civilization. But something else was happening. The cosmic radiation, the exotic matter, the dimensional fluctuations, they were changing us at a fundamental level. High Counselor Vexthera leaned forward, her psychic emanations projecting curiosity and concern. Genetic modification? Technological augmentation? Chen smiled, and the expression held depths that made Zethkar's 6 eyes water slightly. Something much more fundamental than that. We discovered that consciousness itself is a force in the universe, as real and measurable as gravity or electromagnetism. Out there in the deep dark, where reality is thin and malleable, we learn to be conscious differently. The images above them showed human communities that existed as much in thought as in physical space. Children played games that seemed to involve reshaping local reality through will alone. Scientists conducted experiments that required them to temporarily exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Artists created works that could only be fully appreciated by minds expanded beyond their original limits. You see, the mistake everyone makes about humanity is thinking we're defined by our biology, Chen explained. Our bodies, our brains, our genetic code, those are just the hardware we run on. What makes us human is something else entirely, something that turned out to be remarkably adaptable when given the right conditions. Fleet Admiral Kordak, his crystalline form rigid with confusion, managed to formulate a question. But, you're still human. Our sensors confirm baseline genetic structures, normal biological functions. How can you claim to be something else? Because being human was never about the shape of our bodies or the chemistry of our brains, one of Chen's companions answered. She was a small woman who seemed to shimmer slightly around the edges, as if she wasn't entirely committed to existing in just one dimension. Being human is about the pattern of consciousness we embody, the way we think and feel and relate to the universe around us. That pattern can run on biological hardware, yes, but it doesn't have to. The images above them shifted again, showing the gradual transformation of human civilization over the centuries of exile. Ships that began as mechanical constructs gradually became living entities. Cities evolved from built structures into grown organisms. Most remarkably, the humans themselves began to exist as both individuals and components of larger conscious entities, their separate identities preserved while simultaneously participating in collective experiences that span star systems. We learned to be human in ways our ancestors never imagined, Chen continued. A single human consciousness could exist across multiple bodies, or multiple consciousnesses could share a single form. We could be individual when we chose, or collective when it served our purposes. We became a species that existed as much in the realm of pure thought as in physical reality. Dr. Thysera, the Council's xenobiologist, found her voice. But, the humans who remained on Council worlds, they showed no signs of these capabilities. They seemed completely ordinary. Another of Chen's companions answered, this one appearing to be a normal human male until Zethkar noticed that his shadow seemed to extend in directions that defied the amphitheater's lighting. Because we never left them. Distance became meaningless once we learned to exist partially outside normal space. Every human who ever lived remained part of our larger consciousness, whether they knew it or not. Those who stayed behind were our eyes and ears, our connection to the home we'd been forced to leave. The implications struck the Council delegation like a physical blow. The humans hadn't just endured their exile, they had used it as an opportunity to become something unprecedented in galactic history. They had evolved beyond the need for traditional space travel, traditional communication, traditional existence itself. Their return wasn't a conquest or a rescue, it was a natural expression of a consciousness that had grown to encompass the entire galaxy. What happens now? Zethkar asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to hear the answer. Admiral Chen stood, and, as she did, every human in the amphitheater rose with her in perfect synchronization. But their expressions remained kind, patient, welcoming. "Now, we offer you a choice," she said, her words somehow reaching not just the council delegation but every conscious being throughout the galaxy. "You can continue as you are, governing your worlds, maintaining your hierarchies, preserving your ancient orders. We have no desire to rule you or replace your authorities." She gestured, and the air above them filled with new images, council worlds continuing much as they always had, their inhabitants going about their daily lives in peace and prosperity. "But we also offer something else," Chen continued. "We offer you the chance to grow beyond what you've always been. To discover that consciousness is not limited by biology, that intelligence is not constrained by individual minds, that existence itself is far more vast and wonderful than you've ever imagined." The images shifted to show council species beginning to explore new ways of being, Vorthans whose crystalline forms could exist simultaneously as individuals and as facets of larger geometric consciousness, Andromedans whose psychic abilities allowed them to participate in galaxy-spanning collective experiences while maintaining their unique perspectives. "The universe is so much larger than any of us knew," Chen said, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the quantum structure of reality itself. "There are forms of life that exist as pure mathematics, civilizations that experience time backwards, creatures of living starlight who dance between dimensions. We've learned to communicate with them all, to understand their perspectives, to see reality through eyes we never could have imagined." She spread her arms wide, encompassing not just the amphitheater but, somehow, the entire galaxy beyond. "We offer you the chance to join that greater community. To remain who you are while also becoming part of something unimaginably vast and beautiful. The choice is yours, and you can take as long as you need to decide. We've learned patience in our travels through deep time." As the council delegation prepared to return to their ships, to carry this impossible news back to their respective governments, Zethkar found himself wondering if this was how evolution always worked. Not through conflict and conquest, but through invitation and transformation. The humans hadn't returned as conquerors, they had returned as teachers, offering to share the lessons they had learned in their long journey through the cosmic deep. The Great Silence was truly ending, but what was beginning was not a new age of human dominance. It was the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history, a civilization that embraced transformation as its fundamental principle, that saw consciousness itself as the final frontier to be explored. The Council had thought they were ending humanity's story by driving them into exile. Instead, they had provided the conditions for humanity to discover what they were truly capable of becoming. And, now, that transformed humanity was offering to share their discoveries with the very civilization that had rejected them so long ago. The universe had just become a much stranger, much more wonderful place. And, for the first time in centuries, no one could predict what would happen next.